Hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of AACRAO's Credential Chats. We are joined this week by two contributing authors to AACRAO's recent report on learning mobility. We have Zhao, who is associate with the American Council on Education, as well as Lindsey Myers, who's recently the director and principal program officer at the Education Futures Lab at the American Council on Education and is currently working on projects on measuring post-secondary value with various institutions. And I'm sure if yours is not yet one of them, she would love for you to get in touch. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Noah.
Well, absolutely. And, within this, brand new book on learning mobility and empowering educational journeys, you have a, chapter on learning mobility metrics and evaluating impact in order to guide future directions. And, maybe by way of introduction, you could just start off by sharing with us, kind of what brought you to that topic and the lens that you kind of launched into it with.
Yeah, absolutely. So my work at the council has been working with institutions on lots of different topics around learner success. And one of the things that came up repeatedly was this idea of transfer and prior learning assessment and kind of all of these pieces that feed into this broader idea of learning mobility. And so when the opportunity came to us last year to think about this chapter on how we might measure learning mobility and build a system for measurement going forward in the future, that was something that was really exciting and definitely in our wheelhouse, and too good of an opportunity to pass up.
So my interest in this topic actually started years ago in my graduate school when I wrote a paper on how marginalized students can choose majors that maximize their long-term socioeconomic mobility. And I was so fascinated by the question of how educational choices translate into life outcomes and how system can either expand or limit those possibilities. And then when I joined ACE, I had the privilege working with my colleague Lindsey and a partner at the Carnegie Foundation. So we do some groundwork on the new student access and earnings classification. And that work brought me into conversation with national experts and workforce leaders. Over and over, I heard the same underlying questions. So how do we measure mobility in a way that is accurate, fair, and actionable? And how do we design systems that actually enable it? So, and as someone who came to the state as an international student, I know firsthand that not every educational journey is linear. Real life doesn't follow the sequence like from elementary school to high school to college to career. And there are stops, starts, detours, and transfers. So I think systems that only expect a straight line could overlook millions of learners that their paths don't fit in the mold.
I mean, talk about coming by this work honestly. That is just such a great origin that you were already just kind of deep into those weeds. And so, when we start looking at these metrics and what, especially through the interest of, an AACRAO audience of registrars, enrollment management professionals, what are some of the kind of key findings and when we start looking at these metrics of learning and mobility that you really want to make sure people have as takeaways?
I think for me, it is thinking about building those systems. So we we have lots of different interested parties. We are talking about building a system that needs to be relevant for learners, for their families, for their communities. Obviously, institutions and employers have a role in this. So, thinking about how we can work to um, satisfy the needs of all of those different parties in a way that doesn't necessarily recreate some of the traditional stumbling blocks for students, I think is a big piece of this. And I think that a lot of the findings in our chapter, a lot of the suggestions that we make for registrars and other folks thinking about this are in line with a lot of the other recent work that has come out in the LAR Accelerator Project and the 9 principles there. We talk about being learner-centered. We talk about interoperability in the chapter. So it was really interesting to see that although we are trying to check lots of different boxes and satisfy lots of different needs, it really does all come together around the idea of transparency. This is something that Alex and I have talked about a lot. It's something that ACE has been involved in with the College Cost Transparency Initiative. And it's, again, really the key point for building this system. And we need to be able to be transparent to employers about what kinds of skills and knowledges and abilities students are bringing to them. We need to be transparent to students about what they're going to be learning and how what they already know feeds into that. And if those credits aren't going to be accepted in transfer, they need to know why. And does it need to be an all or nothing kind of thing? Can we think about what they already know and scaffolding that so that they can achieve those credits in a way that is faster and less expensive? So I think for me, the findings are really about those ideas of transparency and interoperability and being learner-centered. And it was really, really gratifying to see that those things are coming out in other places too.
And in our appendices after our chapter, we put together the major federal and national data sources that are used to measure learning mobility. And we dug into the nuances, the considerations, and yes, the limitation of each data source. So what we found is that the data landscape is quite fragmented. There's no single data set that follows a learner's entire journey from start to finish. Instead, we get pieces like one system might tell you about enrollment, another about completion, another about wages, but they don't always connect. And we also saw that definitions aren't always consistent. Sometimes a basic definition as completion or persistence or transfer can mean different things in different data set, and they are very different in different data sets. And I think that makes it very difficult to line them up and compare different data sources. And the timing is also very different. Some data sources give updates every year and others only give updates every few years. And that means if something is changing very quickly, like the way how learners transfer between different institutions, it's hard to see those shifts in real time. And there are also gaps in like what population are included. For example, adult learners, non-credit learners, military connect students, and international students like me in many data sets like disappear from the record. For me, I feel like if these people are not included in those data sets, there is a gap in the data and there's usually a gap in policy. And when a group of people is invisible in the data, they often become invisible in practice as well.
That is profound. If you are invisible in the data, you are invisible in practice. And I think that as you were describing some of the specific kind of data sources and data points that we look at, I go back to something that Lindsey, kind of brought home there was that it's about having systems, it's about relevancy, and it's about thinking whose needs do we need to meet with this data, and then how do we go about meeting those needs? And it just really seems listening to you both like that's was just something that when we read this chapter is going to be something that jumps out and just punches us in the face is picture actual real humans like Zhao and what do they need us to be looking at so that we're not just looking at really predictable data that maybe isn't actually telling us the story that we need to be pulling from this. And it just seems like you two are really on to something that helps us rethink of, you know, are there new data points we should be looking at? And I also wonder if part of it is also focusing on not just on what data we need, but why we need it and for whom. And do you have any more comments, Lindsey, about that? And
Yeah, you made so many great points there, but I think the one that you will definitely see come out in the chapter is that underlying these data points, underlying these systems are people. People like Zhe, she told you her story. People like me, my path was a little bit more linear, but I worked the whole time I was an undergrad, and when I did my master's degree, and when I did my PhD, I was a graduate student parent, so thinking about all of these different identities for which traditional higher education was not built is something that is really important to me and is something that definitely comes through in the chapter. We don't tell our own stories in the chapter, but we definitely include personas that are drawn from our own students, from people that we've talked to, from stories that we've heard. So I think that that human-centered piece of data is something that you're going to find in the chapter, and is maybe something that I think we hear lots of people talk about the value of storytelling, but being able to connect those stories to the challenges, to the policy solutions, is something that I think gets lost a little bit. And being able to kind of make that through point again between research, policy, and practice is something that we really try to highlight in the chapter.
You know, I love that something you just pointed out at your framing there, Lindsay. Hear about the, you know, non-traditional learners, which we know is a total misnomer. And that maybe it's not about traditional and non-traditional learners, but systems that are tr for whom higher ed has traditionally been built.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the way you frame that, Lindsay. Thank you so much for that. And you know what, we have time for one more question that I'd love to kind of back to. You we're both really hammering transparency, which I think is so key to trust. It's so key to just basic consumer protection issues, probably. And I think it's also something that AACRAO members, and especially those within offices of the registrar, enrollment management, or it's kind of, where there's a lot of expertise. And so when you talk about transparency, though, when what can that look like when we talk about, these metrics for learning mobility?
Yeah, so I think that we can start logging the reasons behind credit transfer decisions. So even a short note about why credit was or wasn't accepted can go a long way. I feel like it makes if we can like document why we make those decisions, it makes decisions reproducible and it can help us like identify inconsistencies over time. And we sometimes think of credentials and transfer decisions purely back office processes. So I think this cannot be something happening quietly behind the scenes. We need to like make them the critical turning points in a learner's journey.
Yeah, and for me, I would just add that as so you talked about consumer protections, which is a word that is a little bit charged in higher education, but in thinking about how learning has really become a lifelong process, and one where we are consuming learning in lots of different ways and different spaces, it just makes sense that the holder of those data, of those experiences, would transition from an institution that is now just a piece of that to the learner whose story it is to tell.
Um, Love that. Also love that if they ever figure out a way to have credit recommendations for blissful unawareness of controversial comments that you make without realizing it. I've got a whole master's degree in prior learning credit coming my way, I think, because I did not realize that was a charged term. But you two so many just quotables from you two in this episode of AACRAO's Credential Chats. Thank you so much. I personally have not yet read the chapter, and I'm just really excited to dive into it now, because you just make it sound so exciting and just so important of how we can really look at metrics that we're using to, best use as a way to just inform our decisions and strategically serve learners in mission-oriented ways. Lindsey, Zhao, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this week.
Of course, thank you so much. It's my first time doing this kind of conversation, and I'm super appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Noah.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you for watching AACRAO's Credential Chats, and we wish you a badge-worthy week, everybody. So long.